So far with paper 1, we've started to understand that what the exam is asking us to do is look at what a writer does and then explain why the writer might have done that. And with the what, we can look at words, techniques, methods and structure, and the why, we need to think about what the writer intended by using that word or by employing that method. And we can look at the effect, the images created, and any other intention that they might have had. What this diagram shows is a breakdown of the different questions and the part of the text that you need to look in to get your answers for those questions. So if you imagine that rectangle made up of 4 different coloured blocks, imagine that rectangle is all of the text that you have to read. It's the entire piece of reading in the exam. Now, question 1 that you've been doing very well with will always be, as you know, that you proved this in the quiz answers that you gave. Question 1 will always be about the top few lines of the text. It might be lines 1 to 7 or lines 1 to 10. And as you can see there, you need to list facts or things in those lines. Question number 2 will always be a small section from a little bit further down to lines 1 to 7. It will usually be the second paragraph, it might be the third, but it will be at the top half of the text. And as you know, the exam paper is written so that they'll separate out that paragraph for you next to the question, so you can just look at it closely without having to flick backwards and forwards. So question 2, usually about 20 lines of text, and that's where, as you've been practicing, you do your close language analysis. So you're looking at individual words and techniques. Now, question 3 is what we're going to look at over the coming week or so. Now, question 3, you'll see the big long green bar down the side. That tells us that it's not like question 1 about the first few lines. It's not like question 2 about the next few lines. It's about all of the lines. Question 3 asks you to talk about the structure of the whole text, so the entire piece of reading. And we'll look at what that means bit by bit. But what you need to know is question 3 asks you to write about the whole of the piece of text in front of you. Just to be clear for you then, the work you have done so far on sources A to F was for question 1. The work you have done for sources G to Q was for question 2. And now the sources from Q onwards to V are all about question 3. So these ones will be broken down in the next few slides and also in your classroom in forms, so that you can submit your answers like you have been doing for the work on question 2. So just to recap, in sources G to Q for question 2, you have looked at, with the different sources, you've looked at how writers use adjectives, how they use verbs and adverbs, how they use the 5 senses, how they create mood, and how they use literary techniques such as onomatopoeia, personification, similes and metaphors. On the right hand side, these are some sentences that I've taken from the work that you've done, and in those sentences you can see where you've been getting used to writing about these techniques, writing about these methods. And I want to reassure you that the way these sentences have been constructed is along the lines of what you need to do for question 3. So there's not a huge difference, it's just that your topic changes slightly. So if you look at that second sentence, for example, where it says in the opening of this extract, the writer creates a somber mood with the adjective blah blah blah, that's the sort of thing that we're going to be able to do in question 3. So you're already on the right track. So the way that structure works, particularly for a piece of writing, is if you think about a traditional story, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And that's what we need to analyse, that's what we need to write about in question 3. Remember, we're looking at what the writer does and why the writer does it. So for question 3, we look at what the writer does in the beginning and why, what they then do in the middle and why, and how they end. What have they done at the end and why have they done that? So already in your head you should be thinking of some of the things that you are familiar with from your own reading throughout your life. There are certain things that most writers do in the beginning of a text. There are certain things that writers do at the end of a text. Our job is to identify what some of those things are and start developing our ability and our confidence in writing about those things. Mrs. Elliott's 2 videos on structure on the channel will take you through all of this in a lot more detail, so do watch those. But for the purpose of moving through the sources, you can use this for now. But do watch the detailed videos on structure, and Miss Elliott also does a walkthrough of an exam paper, which will be very useful to watch. So we're about to start looking at the first source that you have to answer in your classroom, and this is about openings. So we need to understand how and why a writer uses openings. What is their purpose in the decisions that they make? Well, typically, as we know, writers will open their text with a character or a setting or an event or all 3. So by setting the scene either of who we're going to be spending the next hour, day, couple of weeks with in this book, they'll give us a character. If they want to place that character in a certain situation, they will start with the setting first. More so, be even more specific with an event that's going on. So when we're looking at openings, what we need to start doing is thinking about why writers do that. Why do writers begin with characters, settings, or events? Why do writers start with those things? So have a think about that question, and you can type in the answer into the box in your classroom form. Why do writers usually begin with characters, settings, or events? So now we've looked at what a writer does at the beginning, we now need to look at how they do that. So how do they use language to deliver that information about character, or how do they use language to set up that setting or to describe and present that event to us in the opening? Now the sources that follow have a look at 4 different possible methods. The first is sentence types, the next is speech, the use of speech, the next one looks at the use of contrast, and then finally we look at what happens when an author withholds information. So your first task, before we go on to these next slides, is to answer the question in your form, in your classroom, which says, why does an author withhold information in the opening section of a text? So why would an author withhold information in the opening section of a text? If you withhold something, you keep it back. So this first source is from Jennifer Donnelly's story, A Gathering Light. The extract reads, "When summer comes to the North Woods, time slows down, and some days it stops altogether. The sky, grey and lowering for much of the year, becomes an ocean of blue, so vast and brilliant you can't help but stop what you're doing. Pinning wet sheets to the line maybe, or shucking a bushel of corn on the back steps to stare up at it. Locusts whir in the bushes, coaxing you out of the sun and under the boughs, and the heat stills the air, heavy and sweet with the scent of balsam." So, in that extract, the question says, and you can answer in your form in Google Classroom, explain what the opening 2 sentences make the reader feel. How does the reader make us feel that way? So look back at those first 2 sentences. How do those sentences make you feel? And how do they make you feel that way? When summer comes to the North Woods, time slows down, and some days it stops altogether. How do they make you feel, and why? Now, let's look at the next 2 sentences. So we've done the first 2, which you may or may not have been able to think of how they make you feel, but let's look at these next 2. Firstly, I want you to write down in the box for this question, what is different about these two sentences compared to the first two? So what is different about these two sentences compared to the first two? And how do these sentences add to or change our feelings about the mood of this place? So what is different about these two sentences compared to the first two? And how do these sentences add to or change our feelings about this place? How do they change the mood? Jot down your answer or type up your answer in the box. So let's have a look at the next source, which is source R, and it's by Rachel Hawkins and it's called Hex Hole. Now, when we look at opening lines, the first line in the text that you're given, you can ask yourselves questions such as, what do we learn from this sentence? And that in itself, asking what we learn from that sentence, what do we find out? That will give us an idea about the effect of it. So that's why a writer has chosen that first line. I mean, imagine writing something yourself. Imagine writing a novel or a short story or even a poem. That first line, or a song, that first line can often be the hardest one to decide on, because you've got to think about so many things. Grabbing your reader, making an impact. You've got to think about setting up the mood, the tone for the rest of that chapter. You might need to introduce one of your characters or the setting. So ask yourself always from the opening lines, what do we learn from this? And that will give you a lot to write about in terms of why the writer has structured it. Why have they started in that way? So for this extract, the first question says, why is the first sentence effective here? So what do we learn? And the first sentence is, I stepped out of the car and into the hot, thick heat of August in Georgia. So Georgia is in the United States of America. It's one of the southern states. So in your form, in your Google Classroom, write down your answer. Why is this first sentence effective? What do we learn? Once you've done that question, pause if you're not ready, but once you've done that question, we then need to look at questions 2, 3, and 4. And I'm going to leave those with you to fill in the boxes in your form. In our next source, we're going to look at source T now, which is Someone Else's Life by Katie Dale. What you're going to do is look for techniques that this writer has used to set a clear scene and mood. So in this extract in a moment, you're going to see it starts off with a certain mood and then it changes as the extract develops. So what you're going to write in your form is what mood is created at the start and how the mood changes in the middle, and then how the mood finishes at the end. And I want you to write your answers in your form. So the first bit is started for you. The first line of the extract that you'll see in a minute says, sunlight dances over the little girl's dark curls. So we've said here the writer makes the atmosphere seem happy and relaxed as we have sunlight dancing, personification, so it feels like an upbeat moment. We find out about a character and we wonder who this girl is. We also wonder if she is alone. So if you were asked the question, what has the writer done in the beginning? Well, they've created an atmosphere. It's quite a relaxed one. It's quite happy. It's positive. They've used personification to show sunlight dancing over this little girl. We know there's a little girl. We've been introduced to a character. Why have they done that? Well, it makes us wonder who it is. We wonder if she's alone, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of thing you're going to do. You're going to pick a sentence or two and explain how the writer has either kept that atmosphere going or changed it. All right, so have a go and fill in your answers in the form. We're now going to look at how writers use endings. So we've had a look at the start, we've had a look at how mood is created to develop the text and reveal things as we go along. Now we're going to look at how writers use endings. So effective endings, there are all manner of options that writers can use. Some of the more obvious ones are to leave the reader wanting more. In other words, not tying up all loose ends. So maybe not explaining what happens to characters, maybe leaving a door open for a sequel. We've all been there when we've got to the end of a book and we don't feel satisfied, or we've got to the end of a film. So that's one option. There might be a mystery left for the reader to ponder. So maybe most of the loose ends are tied up, but not all. Or the thing can be resolved in its entirety. So the story can come to an end. Everybody's sorted. Everyone's got an ending of sorts. And we have what's called catharsis, which, as those of you who have studied Greek theatre with me or in drama will know, catharsis is that moment where you can put the book down, leave the cinema and get on with your life. You feel like you are cleansed of everything that you've just been through. It might have been traumatic, it might have been tense, but you feel like you've closed the door on it. So let's have a look at some examples in the sources that you've got on your classroom. So this is from a novel called Gone by Michael Grant, and this is source V. "Help me," Easy whispered. "Sam." Easy's eyes were on Sam, pleading, fading, then just staring, blank. The only sounds now came from the worms. Their hundreds of mouths seemed to make a single sound, one big mouth chewing wetly. A worm spilled from Easy's mouth. Sam raised his hands, palms out. "Sam, no!" Albert yelled. Then, in a quieter voice, "He's already dead." "Albert's right, man. Don't burn them. They're staying in the field. Don't give them a reason to come after us," Adelio hissed. The black worms swarmed over and through Easy's body. Like ants swarmed over and through Easy's body. Like ants swarming a dead beetle. It felt like a very long time before the worms slithered away and tunnelled back into the earth. What they left behind was no longer recognisable as a human being.